So how are you today? Good? Enjoying a rainy day indoors? It's a nice way to spend it. So the talk that I have today, some of you may know that every year we teach an introduction to regression hypnosis or past life hypnosis therapy. And it'll start next week. And we have 60 people coming from as far away as South Africa for the class. And so the class has really had a tremendous resonance. And my interest in hypnosis was really sparked by, of course, Edgar Cayce, who these readings that we have were all received while under hypnotic trance. And so I think that Edgar Cayce invites us to consider what we all might have access to that's beyond our conscious mind. And so he did that. He crossed into the subconscious realm and brought forward what we call these readings. And when I first moved here about 16 years ago, there was an annual course, just like now, being taught by Alan Chips. And I was the facilitator here. And so I sat in on the class, or I served the snack food at the breaks for 4 years. And that became kind of my introduction to past life regression hypnosis. And I'm a clinical social worker, so I used my CEUs. I pursued advanced training in hypnosis and eventually coordinated hypnosis training with past life regression work and came up with the course that we have been teaching here now that I've been teaching in the past 5 or 6 years. Is anyone here coming to that class? Okay, all right. The class starts Sunday, so I was wondering if some of you might be attending. So what I'll be presenting today is kind of the evolution of this work, and it's pretty much what I present to the beginning students, just to orient them to what they're getting into. I've come to call it more than past life regression. I call it soul contact, because when I first started doing this work, what came through was traditional past life memories. So people would open a door and they would find themselves in some other time and place, and they would find themselves in relationship to people that they knew in different contexts. And it would be very, very helpful. They would get a lot of understanding from these experiences. But over time, the work has changed. And that's really why I call it soul contact, because I think you're moving from the realm of your conscious mind, which we're all in right now, and through hypnosis, you move, what I would say, through the veil into the deeper soul mind, the eternal part of us. I was raised Catholic, and we always had a concept, or I was taught that we have an eternal soul which lives on after death. But I never thought of the question, well, what's the soul doing before birth if it's eternal? And so this, in some ways, is a possible answer to that question, that we may perhaps have other experiences here on the earth. So here's Edgar Cayce. It's one of my favorite pictures of him. And I'd just like to acknowledge him, the work that he did, and the founding of this organization. When I think of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which is now called Edgar Cayce's Association for Research and Enlightenment, I think of his intention. And his intention was that whatever happened here be for the spiritual growth of whoever participated. And it didn't have to be about the Edgar Cayce work. It could be about other types of material, as long as it was focused on spiritual growth and development. And that's really the vein of which I teach here. I try to honor Mr. Cayce's intention for this organization. So here's a quote from Edgar Cayce. "The unseen forces are more powerful than those seen." And here he means more than just the subconscious mind. I'd say he's including the subconscious mind, but Edgar Cayce also talks about angels, all kinds of other entities and beings that are helpful to us. I've come to call them guides and council members, but the unseen forces are more powerful than those seen. In psychology, we all know that the subconscious mind really overrides the conscious mind. It's a little bit why you might wake up in the morning with the the intention of exercising or of doing something different. And by the time you go to bed that night, you have the same intention for the next day. It didn't quite get realized, oftentimes because there's subconscious factors that override the conscious mind. Now, how did a nice guy like me end up in a place like this? Well maybe the question you wonder about, maybe I'm not that nice, I don't know. But Cayce has this concept that we choose our parents, that in this reincarnation perspective, in our pre-life planning, the parents that we've come in through, somehow they're the best opportunity for us to do our soul growth and our learning. Does anybody want to leave now at such a preposterous idea? Because it implies that your children also picked you and you're part of a soul group. So that was, with this New Age material, my parents were both psychiatrists, so they were open to metaphysics in many ways. But I'd like to think of myself as also being rational. Like they say, you keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. And so I like to have some kind of perspective about that. But what I've learned to do with kind of new thought is to say, well, if that thought was to be true, what would it imply? So let's say with reincarnation. If there's reincarnation, what does that why do people believe in reincarnation? And this one, well, what does it mean to think that you chose your parents? So in my example, my parents, like I mentioned earlier, they were both Catholic, they were both psychiatrists, and they both had interest in metaphysics. My mother's grandmother was would be called in today's language a medium. And so as a little boy, I got to play with a grandmother figure who had imaginary friends just like me. And so that was made me very curious, and I think it was a spark in this life for the pursuit that I've had of the unseen or the metaphysical. So I think that if I chose my parents, that what I'm doing now in my life seems very connected to the intentions that came through with my parents. Now we're going to talk a little bit about astrology. Cayce puts a high premium on astrology, and one of the unique aspects for myself is that I have Pluto on my ascendant, and Pluto has to do with things of the underworld, things of the subconscious. And so I think that I came in particularly wanting to do the work that I do. I particularly like to get into what's behind the veil, so to speak. It's a unique aspect of my personality. Every day I meet with somebody for the first time and I say, tell me the most intimate details of your personal life immediately. If I had to work at a bank every day, I think I would, thank God there's different people for different occupations. So I found out about Edgar Cayce in college, wasn't really ready to explore it. And after graduate school, I went to a talk given by Harmon Brough. And that really got me revitalized. I went and picked up all the books that I had bought earlier and read them and joined the organization and began coming here for conferences and doing their tours, and moved here, like I said, about 16 years ago. And as I outlined earlier, became part of the facilitating conferences, and then eventually became part of giving conferences. It's strange, the Lord moves in mysterious ways. I remember when I came here, I had a particular ego-oriented idea about what I was going to do here. I had been involved in administration back in Boston, and so I thought that I would become an administrator here. But none of those doors opened. They all went into more public personality, public speaking, and public profiles. And so I just made use of the opportunities that presented themselves. And as you know, Edgar Cayce oftentimes questioned about, he put his whole life, his life force into the ARE and into these readings. And so he oftentimes wondered, was this a good use of his time and energy? And sometimes I have wondered, because I'm doing so much with hypnosis and regression, I've wondered, is this really important work? I knew that, there's plenty of examples of it helping people, and as much as I do counseling, that also helps people. But today, recently, I'd have to say that I've come to an even deeper appreciation of what exactly regression is and how important it is. So in sessions, begin to notice masters showing up. Some would be identified, some wouldn't. They would come and I'll give you some examples later on, but they would give teachings and psychological, emotional healings. What I've also come to understand is that hypnosis is based on suggestibility. A person has to be suggestible in order to go into trance and access hypnosis. And I've seen incredible things happen when someone is suggestible. Now, this last point are physical laws, consciousness-based. This came as an idea. There have been two people that I have met that saw Edgar Cayce in trance during a reading levitate. Harmon and June Bro were there present, and T.J. Davis another time saw Edgar Cayce levitate. And so that defies, in some ways, does it defy? Maybe it doesn't, but that's unusual to have something that has a weight to be able to lift up. There's plenty of stories about that with people that meditate, that somehow they're able to levitate. The way that Harmon and June spoke about it said that when they were present, Edgar Cayce was giving his reading, they couldn't quite hear him. So somebody there said, up, up, and he raised up off the couch. And I guess they said down, down, and he went back down. And then TJ said his incident was separate. TJ Davis was 12 when Edgar Cayce passed away, so Edgar Cayce was a very much like a father figure to TJ. And he said one night, Mr. Cayce said, tonight don't go to sleep. I have 2 guests coming, just stay on the steps and watch. And so TJ said that night 2 men with turbans came into the house, and Mr. Cayce lay down on the couch and after a little while levitated. And so I don't know exactly whether he knew he could levitate or what that was about. Edgar Cayce also in readings spoke different languages on occasion. There's a wonderful story about how the creative forces are so gentle. There was a partnership, a business partnership between 2 men, and one was bilingual in German. They both spoke English, one was bilingual in German. And they came to find out why their business wasn't succeeding. Well, Mr. Cayce goes into trance and he starts to speak German because he wants the German speaker to understand. And he says, why isn't the business succeeding? It's because you're ripping your friend off. He trusts you, and this is what you're doing to him. There's going to be tremendous consequences for you if you don't straighten up. And so Mr. Cayce finished the reading. The German fellow said, oh, I understood perfectly. We're going to be fine. But that's just an example. Also, one time Edgar Cayce apparently played piano at a level that he had never had received the training for. All right, so as we think about this, so Edgar Cayce did not levitate in the everyday conscious state. He was somehow in a trance state, but somehow the trance state superseded what we would consider physical laws. And so this has made me think about, let's say when we think of Jesus walking on water, was he in that state of consciousness that was outside of the ego physical consciousness? Was he kind of in a trance state? It's also made me think about how we oftentimes refer to hypnosis as putting people under, that somehow you're awake now, and I'm going to put you to sleep, and then you're going to access this. I think there's another way of looking at it, that we're actually asleep now, and trance work is actually waking you up. And I think that Edgar Cayce levitating, Jesus walking on water, is in the awakened soul consciousness, which we're all striving towards. You know, even if you look at like the ancient mysteries, you see that ancient cultures, they built with megalithic stones, and now we need tiny little bricks. We have to lift them physically. Apparently there was a time where perhaps we could lift these large objects non-physically or spiritually in a way. So this all becomes interesting about what exactly happens during hypnosis and trance. Now, I was asked in the last couple of months to present on the book of Revelation. I've always wanted to have a better understanding of it. You know, it's a little bit like I had no idea what I was getting into. That became like, it sucked my life for about 3 months, just trying to wrap my head around what was going on in this book of Revelation. It's really it's an epic kind of story where John is the hero, and he goes through all these different experiences. It reminds me a little bit of like an oral tale. Like I think before, there were books, stories had to be quite elaborate, and people would tell them, like, Homer, the Iliad or the Odyssey, to entertain a crowd. And so there seems just to be such dramatic elements to it. But let's look at, in chapter 11, Cayce talks about the two witnesses. The two witnesses appear to John. And here's Edgar Cayce's, here's the question: what's meant by the two witnesses mentioned in Revelation 11:3? Are they the mental and emotional bodies of the soul of man? And let's look at Mr. Cayce's answer. This may be the interpretation then, the mental or the subconscious, but rather it is the consciousness or the conscious of physical lives, or the attributes and consciousness in the experiences of the soul in the attributes of physical consciousness. So one of the twins, Edgar Cayce is saying, is in some ways our past life memories. Now the bigger picture is that when Cayce talks about Revelation, he says the first half of the book is explaining the interface with your spiritual anatomy and your physical anatomy. He talks about the interface of what we would call the chakras and the endocrine system. And then he talks about how your karma is actually stored in they call them the 7 seals, which are the 7 chakras, and they open as when your karma gets released and you have to work through what is coming to you. But Cayce says that in your spiritual evolution, that at some point you have to come to terms with that there is much more to you than the little consciousness that was born April 12th, whatever year, and is going to cross, whatever day. This little slice of you is really like a day in the life of your soul. And every seeker has to at some point transcend and become aware in some ways of their soul consciousness. So he's saying one of the twins, one of the influences that we all have are those things of past lives. And then he continues, an individual experience in the earth plane is motivated by that which arises from its sojourns in the influences of the consciousness outside of the physical being. So he's saying you can't stay landlocked in your spiritual consciousness. You have to realize there's much more to you than your physical being. Or as he would say, astrologically, the sojourns in the environment of Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Neptune, Saturn, Uranus, the sun and moon, and the constellations, those effects on same emotionally from the innate forces and by the emotional effects from sojourns in the earth. So what he's saying is that the two witnesses are powerful kind of subconscious, semi-conscious influences from the wholeness of ourselves, which are our past lives and our astrology. That before this little life, there were past lives, and there's an astrological influence that has a power in this experience. Now here he talks about how the planetary urges are mental urges that are in the individuality. The individuality is what Cayce would say is more your subconscious mind. The personality, and he says here, while appearances in the earth of the various sojourns are but the personality of the entity's experience, are as urges from the emotions that have been created. Now, here what he's saying is that our astrological influences are like they're in our skeletal system. They're in the deeper part of us. They're not as accessible to consciousness. Like we rarely have a dream where we say, oh my God, last night I remembered being in Jupiter. That was so cool. No, you might remember a past life, but you might not necessarily remember planetary sojourn. But what he applies here is that one of the biggest challenges for a soul in a physical body, and there's a couple of them, one of them is that the soul has to cleave. The soul is androgynous, and so the soul has to project half of itself through the feminine or the other half of itself as the masculine. So that's a trick, kind of balancing those two, that split that has to happen while we're in these divided bodies. But he says also that the soul doesn't have emotions. That when you're in your soul consciousness, there's no arguing, there's no slamming of doors, there's no like, no, I'm not going to talk to you. That happens here. The soul consciousness, what we would call love, are states of consciousness. They're like when you meditate and you get into a state of consciousness, you wouldn't say that that's an emotion. Emotion is much more derived from your endocrine system, from the hormones that are released, anger and fear and those sorts of things. Now, the karma, so to speak, is emotional. So what we're going to experience as you open your seals, as you open your chakras, deal with the karma, you're going to have emotional influences. And so, but again, the witnesses that he's talking about is that you have to realize that your emotional reactions have a lot to do with the past. And it's very helpful to understand that. Now, later I'll bring it in now, but I'm a poster child for talk therapy. I did talk therapy for like 25 years. It's wonderful, very, very helpful. But there are issues that you can't get at through talk therapy because they're so subconscious. And I'll tell you a story about something I had to work out with my sister I didn't even know. It just came up in a past life regression, and it was like an aha moment helping me understand some of the dynamics that we were sharing. Okay, it'll get more practical. I just really loved the book of Revelation. I think it really it gave me a very strong matrix and an understanding of the importance of doing regression work. I remember at first I thought, well, is it just for fun? Is it just play that people do this work? Well, Cayce's saying, no, it's very foundational that you realize where you've come from to help you decide where you want to go. So now they're talking about the death of the two witnesses, which happens in Revelation. Eventually there's the two witnesses and eventually they die. Explain the symbol of the death of the two witnesses. And I've abbreviated some. It says, the Master gave, before the world was, I am. Now if you abide in me and I in the Father, then I will bring to thy remembrance all things from the foundations of the world. That's what you do in a regression. You come into remembrance, I don't know of all things, but you, depending how deep your trance is, Edgar Cayce could go to pretty much a lot of things. Most people can access the things that are relevant to themselves. See, I think that we talk about the Akashic records. You've all heard of that term. Edgar Cayce, when he would do a past life reading for somebody, or they called a life reading, he would access something called the Akashic records. And he said the Akashic records comes from the term Akasha, which is Sanskrit for ether, and that each moment is sort of filmed in this kind of etheric plane. And so he was able to access that. So I think of it, you can think of it kind of like a library. It's a kind of a multidimensional library because it's actually interactive. And so he could access this universal library. But I think that each one of us has a personal Akashic record, meaning just like there's a central library, you can go to, down on Virginia Beach Boulevard and go to the big library down there. But most of us have a small library at home, a personal library. So I think when you do trance work, it's much easier to access your personal library. It's closer than what Edgar Cayce would do to go all the way out and access the universal Akashic records. So continuing here from the foundation words, yet these are as dead, or the only consciousness that arises from same is that which is fanned into life or activity by the laws concerning same. So he says this aspect of yourself has to be awakened, that just going about everyday life, you're not going to remember. There might be dreams, but you could easily slough them off, and that there's an importance to coming into touch with how much more there is to you than just this physical experience, this current one. Hence they are as dead, but become alive again by remembrance, by the application of thought, in what? The light of that which has been attained by the entity or soul that has applied the former lessons in its experience. So you get this. You start to see kind of things that didn't work out, things you tried, things that worked out. So this remembrance is very, very, very helpful as you recollect a past experience. And what it triggers oftentimes is a level of compassion and forgiveness. That oftentimes it's hard to have compassion and forgiveness without knowing the whole story. If somebody's mean to us, it's hard to, regression can show you a larger context of that relationship with that individual. And sometimes in that memory, it's easier to move and progress spiritually. Yes, I've mentioned this. On the spiritual path, the seeker must address their past life influences and their astrological influences. So I believe this work is very foundational for spiritual development. It's like another way I can sell this. Next year we'll have 150. So past lives are recorded emotionally, and so when you do this work, you go for emotion. When the students come in, they are a little shocked because every student is within an arm's length of Kleenex, and so you have to get comfortable dealing with emotion to do this work. I'll say this later, but it's a good point. You see, one of the things that I thought about with the difference between talk therapy and, let's say, regression hypnosis therapy or hypnotherapy, whatever you want to call it, is that talk therapy is oftentimes very cognitive. And so you're talking about your feelings. And sometimes when you're talking about your feelings, that you're talking about things that happen that feel static. A lot of clients will say, I don't want to talk anymore about what happened when I was a kid. Why am I stuck? I know that this influenced me, but why is it so powerful? Well, what a regression does is it gets you into the emotional experience, not necessarily of your childhood, but going back in time to a place of that inception. And then it's not static. Like, I think that while you're reading the Akashic record, there's interactive elements to it. So I think that if you were to watch yourself being traumatized, that's traumatic. But if you're to experience the trauma and in some ways get a different view about what's occurring, that's very, very healing. So talk therapy, I think, is cognitive and rational, and regression hypnosis therapy, I think, becomes emotional and experiential. So you're not dealing with things that are static. And I'll give you some examples of how that occurs. Now, this is just a long way of Edgar Cayce saying that we have to own that we're meeting ourselves. That's something that I think we all know intellectually. It's really underscored in the book of Revelation. And as I've applied that in the months since I've read that, it's a very, very helpful concept that what's coming to you in some ways is relevant. It's not alien to you. You're meeting yourself in some way, or you're meeting a lesson, or you're meeting something that's important. And if you resist it, it'll persist. If you in some ways embrace it and work with it and try to spiritualize it, then it'll release. And we might need some examples of that. So what are the takeaways from this? See, I think that one of the huge challenges of the soul in a body is that we are multidimensional beings, and we're in a little 3D spacesuit. So you're trying to fit an infinite consciousness into this tiny little 3D thing. It doesn't fit. So what happens is, well, Cayce said fourth dimensional, it's the level of thought. So fourth dimension helps us interact with the deeper self. But once it gets into 5th, 6th, 8th, 20, that has to all go in the subconscious mind. And so most of us, as we've kind of come into this earth, we have amnesia. We think this is who we are. Most of you here have a different view because you're somewhat awakened or working on that here, coming with the ARE. But there's plenty of people that think when you die, that's it. You're born and that's just make do. They don't think anything about an eternal sense of themselves. But that's not uncommon because we have this kind of amnesia. As we've come in here, we have spiritual amnesia. And I think people like Edgar Cayce and the great avatars, they come to try to awaken us, to remind us of who we are and where we've come from. So I think oftentimes that we're born like in the middle of a movie. I'll tell you a strange story. Maybe it was purposeful, but my parents in many ways were very relaxed people. And if we wanted to go to the movies, they never looked at the time. Just, let's go see a movie. And we would walk in, middle, end. I remember we went in to see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We walked in the last 5 minutes. Have you seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Everybody is sobbing. So we go in and everybody's like, woo! And I'm like, whoa, what's this movie about? So we watched it over, and then we were all sobbing at the end of the movie. So I remember it was a big moment when my older sister went to college and realized that most people don't just walk into movies in the middle. And she said, I want to see this movie from the beginning. And it was just, the whole family had, oh my God, we're going to have to start looking at times. And But it it was a change. I started as a kid, started seeing, oh, okay, maybe it's nice to see movies from the beginning. But I always think of it because I think that with incarnation, that we're all born in the middle of a movie. Meaning that we come in and, you probably wonder, I get along great with my mom. How come my sister and my mom hate each other? How come they fight so much? Or how come I do this and I don't understand? A regression helps you fill in the scenes that you didn't catch, that help things make more sense and help you let go of things. Also, I think that this is so complex, is that I don't believe that there are any victims. I think that there's a complexity to life which excludes victimhood. Cayce does talk about that sometimes there are mistakes that happen. Sometimes there are errors. But they're not common. There's such a vast complexity. I think in the New Age we like to say there are no accidents. And Cayce says, yes, sometimes there are but not common. It's that we're very protected and there's an incredible organizing principle that keeps things on track. But my work has come to show me that there aren't victims. Not that everything is karmic either. Not that everything that you're meeting has to do with you having been bad in a past life and now it's coming back to you. Sometimes it's soul voluntarism. Sometimes you're picking experiences to help others. Sometimes you're needing something for your own soul growth. This could be a whole talk. But as Edgar Cayce oftentimes said, we grow to heaven leaning on the arm of those that we've helped. So that when you ascend in spiritual consciousness, it's because you've helped somebody, right? You catch that? Now, most of you here, right, it's easier to help somebody than that somebody help you, right? Well, you're being spiritually selfish because you have to let people help you for them to ascend spiritually. So oftentimes, somebody that comes into a handicapped body is oftentimes dedicating a whole life of service to help other people grow spiritually. So that's just an idea I put out there. And, my father was a Freudian analyst, and so there was a lot of premium put on insight. And I think Freud would have loved regression because he was so into the unconscious childhood roots of things. I think if he would have, the psychoanalysis applies easily to regression because you're going into the even deeper subconscious roots of issues. You may not know, but when Freud passed away, shortly before that, he said if he had another life, he would dedicate it to psychic studies, to occult, I think is the word he used. And so he's probably back. He's probably amongst us doing some really interesting research. Now, this is, I oftentimes start with this commentary, and I use it for anything because, Edgar Cayce gave readings on 10,000 different subjects, a little bit about aliens, there's a little bit there about, let me see what other subjects, about the unusual nature of space and time. There are all these kind of out there concepts, but here he says in a very basic way, only that which produces or makes for experiences that make a citizen a better citizen, a father a better father, a mother a better mother, a neighbor a better neighbor is constructive. And then he says, there's other readings where he quotes this and he says, if it doesn't do that, then just leave it alone. If it doesn't make you a better person, then don't pour your life energy into that. Here he goes, and to find that you lived and died and were buried under the cherry tree in grandmother's garden does not make thee one whit a better neighbor, citizen, mother, or father. So here he seems like he's almost putting down past life recall so you can remember. But what he's saying is that the purpose of a life reading or regression isn't that you just kind of try to find out, where was the garden? How tall was the tree? What was the name of the state? That's not the relevant part. It says, but to know that you spoke unkindly and suffered for it, and that in the present you can correct it by being righteous. That's worthwhile. See, I think this is the benefit of a regression, is that you can remember something and it helps you kind of come to the consciousness of that which you need to atone for or make amends to. All right, I'll give you a little bit of the theory behind this. I think I covered this a little bit, that we are, in our creation, now we're in a three-dimensional mind, so it's hard to to comprehend of multidimensionality. And so Edgar Cayce would oftentimes say that for the readings that were on God or on infinite dimensional realities, they had to be simplified for our third grade minds to understand. But it seems that in essence, our soul has two key aspects. It has the aspect to be in the oneness consciousness, but we've also been given the privilege of experiencing individuality. So that in a way you could say, like, we're all cells in the body of God, but we also have the ability to be aware of, oh, I'm a liver cell, or I'm a kidney cell. We have that. We can be in our individual nature, but we can also bump up into the collective nature. That's the dual nature of the consciousness of the soul. Now, what's happened in this, this sojourn, which is really told in the prodigal son story, what's happened in this experience is we've come to this earth plane, as we've come to the separation in a way, that we've moved away from the wholeness, the oneness, and moved into separation. Here, we're overly identified with the separate aspect of creation, meaning that while we're here, we can easily notice ourselves as individuals, but that sense of awe, when you look at a view and you feel connected to all things, that's more difficult. Do you follow me on that? So that in our soul reality, we realize that we can be one with God, but we can also be individuals. Here, we're kind of trapped or stuck in our individual separateness. And the lessons, the teachers have come to try to help us get into back into the oneness consciousness. Now, Cayce talks about different root races that have emerged. And it seems that the chassis, it's kind of like Detroit. Every couple years they make a new body or new chassis for a car. The human spiritual chassis has evolved over time. And one of the changes that happened, or evolutions, was that we developed the chakras. One of the root races said the human being needs like a LoJack system, a LoJack GPS system, so that it can have some way to access or remind itself of its spiritual connection. Now, some of you here remember something called maps? Remember a piece of paper, you'd buy them at gas stations? You'd unfold them and you could never refold them right. You remember those? Rand McNally, are they broke or do they make GPSs now? I don't know. But has anyone used maps now? I couldn't find my way home. Oh, a couple of you. All right, good, way to go. Yeah, when the great loss of internet happens, we'll all look for you so we can find our way home. I use my GPS for everything. So it's just but what I think of a GPS is that while you're driving here on the earth, you have access to a satellite. And the satellite has the bigger view. And so it tells you take a left, take a right, it tells you when recalculating, when you've taken a wrong turn. And most of us, when we come into the world, we're stuck in the map world. But we have GPS potentials now. Well, we've always had them, but the GPS, as above, so below. So there's ways that we can activate both the individual and the collective consciousness that is our inheritance, is our nature. Now, the great teachers, probably one of the how do you activate your GPS system? Well, I call it the God positioning system, but don't throw things. But the Buddha, he comes in and teaches meditation. So you have to move past the mind. I call the thoughts or the atmosphere of the ego. Rene Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So the Western world thought you couldn't exist beyond thought. Really kind of a thinkocentrism. But Eastern, we're like, man, it's cool when you put aside thoughts. When you put aside thoughts, you can move into your wholeness, into your reality. And so that's using your endocrine system, endocrine chakra interface, to tune in to your GPS system. Now, oftentimes, if we don't meditate, the GPS kind of sends us a flash. Like, did everybody get that presidential alert on their text message? Well, every now and then you get a flash, and that can be a dream or a nightmare. That's going to try to, because you're not using your GPS, so it's kind of saying, hey, you need to pay attention to something, okay? And then you wake up and the dream is usually symbolically representing some direction that you're taking, that if it's a nightmare, it's a warning. If it's another dream, if you're paying attention to your dreams, they can be helpful either way. Now, I think that one of the other ways is like Edgar Cayce did, through hypnosis. That's a way that we can access the higher consciousness. Another way, of course, is near-death experiences, but I don't recommend those, okay? Don't try those at home. It's much safer. I think a regression is sort of like a near-death experience. You kind of move into an alternate consciousness. So here's just a way of thinking of it. Here's the tip of the iceberg, and then when we do regression, we try to move people into their deeper consciousness, kind of move through that. So I think of it oftentimes that there's like an ego-soul seesaw. So that before we're born, we're in soul consciousness, right? And then we're born into this world and we become ego conscious, and the soul goes into the subconscious realm. Then we go to sleep and the soul becomes predominant through dreams. Then we wake up, ego again, then we meditate, we get a little bit more of soul consciousness. And in regression, you're trying to, what we call, subjugate the ego. Trying to put the ego a little bit quiet so that you can access the bigger part of you. So you're trying to turn on your GPS system to move into that higher consciousness. And here's a reading, and Cayce quotes Corinthians here: "For indeed to be absent from the body is to be present with God." So that explains in a way that seesaw, that when we're in ego-body consciousness, we're kind of, God is in the subconscious. But when we're absent from the body, when we move out of body consciousness, we move into more of our divine consciousness. Now the trick with doing hypnosis regression is that usually the ego has to be suppressed to get soul consciousness. So when you sleep, so the ego is no longer active, then soul can come through. When you meditate, you're trying to control the ego mind so that you can go into a deeper consciousness. Now the trick with regression is that you're trying to take the person into the subconscious with consciousness. So it's a trick, because you're trying to, there's a veil, right? Remember that veil? Well, this veil, we don't usually cross here. This is waking consciousness, and this is everything else. So you're trying to get the person to kind of, it's a little bit like a lucid dream. You're trying to have them be a little lucid when they're in these places. And that's the challenge or the art of hypnosis, is that you have to individualize sessions, work with people kind of doing the induction. The induction is like a guided meditation where you tell them, relax and be peaceful, but stay connected to my voice. Notice a part of you is relaxing, part of you is connected to my voice. My voice is going to guide you behind the veil. And if it's successful, you're able to move with their consciousness here. Now, it's very, very fascinating how it's different for different people. For some people, it's like, I used to scuba dive. For some people, it's like when they first get there, I don't hear anything from them. And then they come up and they say, oh my God, I'm in Rome and blah, 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 this is going on, and I'm going to go back. And they go back, and I just wait for them on the surface for them to fill me in. Now, some people describe it like they're watching a movie. So they're seeing something, and it's like, imagine talking on the cell phone, and don't do this, but you're talking to somebody while you're watching a movie. Then some people go in the movie, and they're aware, they're still in a way watching it, and then some people get immersed in the movie, and they're telling the story from the first person account. But most people have recollection of what they bring forward. In a way, that's the purpose of it, because just to bring people to the subconscious, you can just have them take a nap. But the purpose of a regression is for them to have consciousness so that they can bring this forward. And what I oftentimes say is that this part of them is so eager, it so much wants them to listen. So oftentimes it's like the person may want something, but I oftentimes tell them, your soul already wants to birth something into your awareness. So something's going to come through for you. And sometimes people say, is it okay for people to come if they're just curious? Do they have to have an intention or a purpose? No, being curious is perfectly fine, but oftentimes I tell somebody, it's like being curious and going for exploratory surgery. You might find something while you're there. And so I don't put it in those scary terms, but I know that they're being prompted in some kind of way. And the soul consciousness is so sensitive and so delicate. It works with that person uniquely. And so I have learned, let's say when you first learn how to be a regressionist, you're a bit of a tour guide. You ever gone to the art museum? Hello, I'm your tour guide, and we're going to go to room 1, and in room 1 we have blah, 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 take a picture, now we're going to room 2. You had that kind of tour? That's kind of guided. What I've learned to do over time is that I feel that their soul consciousness is much more intelligent about what they need to do. And so I take them to the art museum, and I'd say, where would you like to go? Oh, I'm walking into room number 3. There's this. So I follow that. But the art of it also is knowing when to follow and when to lead, because everybody's different. What I tell my students is that the only difference between me and them is I've done about 5,000 regressions. When you do about 5,000 regressions, you figure this stuff out. It becomes anything you've done 5,000 times, hopefully, you're good at. Yes. And so for some people, I think the next slide shows it. See, we're moving from left brain. The left brain is very important in the waking state. You can't do math without the left brain. You can't drive. You can't do all the things, get dressed, all these important aspects. But when we dream, this is where dreaming happens. This is if you look at the brain waves, the brain stimulation, dreams, this part gets activated. And so this is where people that are more artistic have more of a developed right brain. But it's difficult for some folks, like I talk about, it's like bringing the engineer to the art museum. Some people they have very muscle-bound left brains. And so coming into this world is a little bit like, what? What's this? Huh? This can't be real. They oftentimes have that dialogue because this process becomes imaginative. This is coming through your imagination. I think that's the next slide. And Cayce says the imagination is the bridge to the psychic. This guy thinks the imagination, you can't build a bridge. Try being an engineer and using your imagination. You're going to be unemployed pretty quick, right? So you've developed this consciousness. But to do this, you have to be creative, you have to be imaginative. And so for some people, that's more difficult than for others. Some people naturally take to, I remember the first time I did a regression myself, I saw a man on a very old ship. It looked like Christopher Columbus. I don't have anything to do with ships. I've maybe been on one ship, like those old ships that are in Boston Harbor. So I just saw a guy on a ship. And I was telling the regressionist about it, but there was a part of me like going, am I making this up? Where the heck is this coming from? Is this from a movie? Am I really hypnotized? This is wacky, right? So I'm doing all that, right? But there's all kinds of parts, we have all kinds of parts in our head. So part of me's talking away and part of me's doubting away. But the talking part of me said, oh, that's me. I'm the purser of the ship. And the doubting Thomas part of me, this little part of me that was born, January 21st, and I don't know yet when I'm going to cross over. This little part of me knows nothing about ships, never used the word purser, didn't know what that meant. But this part of me knew that I had been the banker, the bookkeeper of the ship. So that helped me suspend my disbelief. And that's what, you've heard that when you read a novel. You have to suspend your disbelief. When you go to a movie, you can't be overly critical, you won't enjoy it. The same for this experience. You have to suspend your disbelief to go into this imaginative, creative space. For some people, that's easier than others. So hypnosis, just defining it, it's just somehow they discovered that between being awake and asleep, the mind opens to suggestion. That's the definition of hypnosis, the suggestibility of the mind between wakefulness and sleep. So hypnosis is a tool that you can use for weight loss, you can use it for smoking cessation. Here we use it for soul contact, past life recall. But it's the same tool, just different, just like you can use a hammer for 10 things or a screwdriver. So hypnosis is a tool, regression is the application of that tool. Now, Houston Smith used to come and speak here, and he was a wonderful, anyone hear him speak when he gets to come? He was a Berkeley professor, and he wrote several books on world religions. And so he was just a very unifying person. And one of the things he spoke about when he came here, he says that what we need as souls in physical bodies is transcendent experiences. Experiences that take us out of the day-to-day laundry, changing the tires, you know. Like it's, when I'm going about doing those sorts of things, and when I do a regression, I'm thinking, God, someone remembered a very important life, and there were 4 important moments in that life. No, I've never had a regression where someone recalls like, oh, I'm doing laundry. You know, I'm out of bleach. I got to go to the store. Now, we don't remember that. We go to some highlight experience. But we've gotten less and less transcendent. You know, I think that ancient cultures, they had initiations, they had sacred plants, and I think we're using, you know, Colorado and Washington are way into the sacred plants. You know, they're trying to help us have these transcendent experiences. So what we need is these transcendent experiences, but they're sorely lacking. We have hardly any opportunities to have transcendent experiences. And I think that a regression is, I think what impresses many people about a regression is that they were able to experience something somehow that did something profound for them. There was a lot of emotional release, so there was something that shifted for them in that experience. And I covered this. The traditional therapy is largely cognitive, but regressions get into the emotion and the experience. Cayce talks about how all subconscious minds are connected. So this is a little bit about when you're trying to find a hypnotist, hypnotherapist, you know, make sure that you resonate with that person, because when you're doing trance work, your subconscious minds are going to connect with each other. So you want to make sure, interview the person, talk to them on the phone or something like that. Now, what I differentiate the old age into the new age is that, let's say in the old age, the Piscean age, that's epitomized by Jesus. For Jesus was around, all you had to do is show up. You could show up with leprosy, show up blind, show up dead. You know, Jesus, boom, Jesus did all the heavy lifting for you. So, you know, they say showing up is half a life. When Jesus was around, it was everything. Just show up, he'll take care of it from there. And so, does that really work? You know, that's like, you know, spiritual healing, welfare. And I don't mean to make any political, but you know, if somebody's doing all the heavy lifting for you, what are you doing for yourself? What are you doing for your own karma? So I think, was that working so well? So then Edgar Cayce comes around. It's a little bit of the evolution of the consciousness. So Edgar Cayce never healed anyone. No one ever came to see Edgar Cayce and boom, you're healed. Never. What they got was you got to get 20 colonics, you got to get castor oil packs for 3 years, and people had hard times with those, and they asked why. And he says, because in the application is the working through of the karma. So you get sick slowly, you had to get well slowly. So there was an important piece of our own work in that. And I think that this new age, what we're coming into now, is that what I'm finding is that through regression hypnosis, people can access the healing resources within. They can access the Jesus, the healer, the Buddha, whatever you want to call it, within, and they can guide themselves. They don't so much need an external guide. And I think we're early in this transition, but I think that's what we're moving towards, accessing our own GPS system, our own divinity. And I talked a little bit about the Akashic records, the personal versus the collective. Now, one of the things, the traditional model for dealing with traumas was that people were supposed to come into therapy and talk about all their traumas. Now, it was not a good model for business. It wasn't a good model for the clients. Clients stopped showing up. They were getting re-traumatized. And so that just remembering trauma is traumatizing. It's not helpful. So what they've developed are techniques that I think are trance-inducing, like EMDR, which helps you reprocess in an altered state of consciousness. And so emotions are processed very differently while in trance. So somebody can be they can be experiencing a death, they can be very, very large expression and release of emotion, and I actually enhance that. I actually want that, help that come through. But then what happens with my experience is that when the person comes out, it's like, whew, it's like a bit like waking up from a bad dream. They think it's not, oh, okay, that happened in a different level of consciousness. It doesn't linger the same way that if they were just remembering a trauma. And then in the processing of it, it's actually a reprocessing. They're not just remembering an experience. It's not static. They're getting lots of new information about this experience, and then they're integrating with how that has influences in the here and now. This is just explains that hypnotizability is a bell-shaped curve. Most people are mildly to moderately hypnotizable. There's highly hypnotizable people, and then some folks that take more work to be hypnotized. But in the mild to moderate state of trance, I'd say about 80% of people can easily have a regression experience. Now let me give you some of the kind of the details, the kind of the meat and potatoes, like examples of this work. I'll start with very personally with a relationship. I have two sisters. I have an oldest sister, and growing up, I never really thought I had an issue with my oldest sister. But as I grew up and got older, if I ever saw like a family picture for Christmas, I might wonder, I'd say, who is that? And I go, oh my God, that's my sister. You know, odd, right? That I would remember my brother, remember my sister, but this one sister, it was something a little strange. I didn't think anything of it at the time. So my mother was very close with my oldest sister, and like I would say, like kind of like too close. And my sister was married and then divorced, and she had a child. And then in her second marriage, her second husband, he took exception to this relationship that my sister had with my mother and my father, and he set boundaries. And at first I thought, well, that's, you know, my sister needed that, and oftentimes somebody marries somebody to do the work for them. Like my sister might have had a hard time setting boundaries with her mother, and so she used this fella to do it. So at first I thought that was fine. But he didn't stop there. He started establishing, well, I wouldn't even say boundaries, he started just limiting access for her to us, and then to her own son from the first marriage. And so this was very disturbing to me. And as I look back, I would send her emails that were almost shaming, very toxic about what is she doing? How can she's been abducted by this guy? She's a psychiatrist, so I would use psychobabble to shame her. I laugh now, not a good thing. And so as I was in this process of being so upset, when you come here to ARE, you meet these really nice, enlightened people. And so I was telling this story to somebody, and they're like, Peter, why can't you just love her the way she is? Why can't you just accept her? And I'm like, would you shut up, like, you know, Sultan of the Divine? I never thought of that. Oh, what a great idea. I'll just forgive her, snap my fingers, you know. Do I have to twinkle my nose like Bewitched? So, you know, I knew that there was good advice, but it was something that was, you know, it didn't fit, it didn't rub. Okay, so this was not a big factor in my life. Now I go to Brian Weiss's training, and when you train, you get lots of regressions. You have to practice. And so in one of the first session, I see myself heading to prayers. I know right away I'm in Ireland, and I'm not happy. I think I'm in my 20s, and I hate going to prayers. It's the collection of people here that are becoming priests. None of them volunteered for this. It's like half mental asylum, half orphanage. And so prayers half the people are praying backwards and mumbling. So I was not happy. So the regressionist said, well, how did you get here? So, you know, I'm accepting suggestions. So I saw myself as a little boy with a little suitcase, and I'm terrified, and I'm angry because I'm being left. I'm being put up for adoption. And I look over and see my parents. Guess who they are? It's my sister and her husband. So right away, but see, I say that the injury happens because we identify too much with this little individual self. But when you're in a regression, you're in the collective. You could say I'm in the Akashic record. So I can go and read her Akashic record. So I went into her experience, and she was horrified. It wasn't something she wanted to do. They were poor. they couldn't afford to feed all the children. They had like 12 or 13 kids. You know, it's the wonderful way the Catholic Church kept us. Anyway, I have Catholic karma. I don't want to reincarnate as a bishop or anything. And so they thought I was the strongest, that I could survive. I didn't know that. And then I also realized that this was Ireland. This was happening all over the country. It wasn't personal. The little boy took it personally. And I realized that I had subconsciously held on to that memory of my sister. Now, I use this as a good example because I could have done years of psychotherapy. I would have never accessed that. It had to come through from this subconscious, subtle way that there was something that was interfering or some past life issue that was playing out with my sister that I wasn't even aware of. Now, when I came out of the experience, I was free. I felt like, oh, I get it. So I called my sister pretty soon after and said, hey, you know, we haven't gotten together in a while. Why don't we meet up? And she was, oh, really, meet up? Well, let me talk to my husband and I'll call you back. I'm like, okay, no problem. So she calls me back and she said, well, he wants to join us and here's a list of all the things we can't talk about, you know. The old me would have said, I'm going to talk about each one of those. And I said, okay, they like to go on cruises and we can talk about the weather. So I met with them and didn't talk about anything. I didn't want to talk about anything that they didn't want to talk about. Just kind of hung with them. Now, I wouldn't say that they're my favorite people. I think they're working out a lot of karma, but I felt like I let something go. I could be with them as two people that we had an injury in the past, and I wanted to release it and let it go. And so that's how I've felt since then. Now, we have till 12, right? Are you guys getting antsy? No? Okay. This woman came to me she was from Scotland, and she came with, she had these dreams her whole life. She was in her 70s now, but she had these dreams. Yeah, grab a seat. She had dreams about the Crusades, very vivid and very feelingful and not in a good way. And so she said, you know what, I need to address this. So I want to face if there's any crusade karma that I have to do. Now, like I said, most people when they come for regression, they're happy when they come in and they're really sad when they leave. No, that's not how it is. But most of them are really happy when they come in. So have somebody who's anxious and kind of not wanting to, fearful. So was I. I was kind of, oh my God, what are we going to encounter? So we do the regression. She gets to the door and she says, wait a minute, I saw a gold key. Can I go find it? And I said, no way, get through that door. No, I didn't say that. I wrote an article and I made that joke, and I don't make jokes writing anymore because they thought that I was the kamikaze regressionist, that I forced a person. I never would do that. It was a joke. And so I said, no, go ahead, find the key. So she goes back to this field. She finds the gold key. She says, oh, this is for a treasure chest. And she finds the treasure chest. She puts in the key. It opens up, and there's a ruby pendant there. And she says, oh, this is a gift to me from Jesus. And so she puts on the ruby pendant, and it seems like when it touches over her heart center, that she's now transformed into an experience. And it starts with seeing Jesus from the back. She sees him with some children. At some point, he is aware of her and turns towards her, and telepathically, he communicates to her, you're a great person. Let that go. All that matters is who you are now. And he was teaching both of us what redemption is. Basically, he was telling her, you're holding on to something that you've met that. It's resolved. You've learned. You're not doing that anymore. So let that go. Just enjoy. Keep being who you are. So we both cried. But I felt like I really understand redemption so much better from having learned it telepathically from Jesus in that experience. Now another one, they're all interesting, but a fella came who had intermittent laryngitis. And so he had heard about that Edgar Cayce. That's how Edgar Cayce started doing hypnosis. It was through his own, it wasn't intermittent. Edgar Cayce had it for about 9 straight months. He lost his voice. And so he had read about how Edgar Cayce had used hypnosis to overcome it. And this fella had been to the doctors and they couldn't find any physical cause for his condition. So he came for a session. This was early in my practice. So as he begins to go under or whatever, wake up, whatever you want to call it, he sees a man with a spear. And my early thinking is, man with spear, bad. Let's go find candy canes and unicorns. Now let's go to the left. Man with spear at the next turn. So I'm like, oh my God, we got to try again. So we go to another door, third door, man with spear. What I've learned now is that the psyche naturally wants to heal itself. Get out of the way. I was delaying a process that needed to happen. So by a third time, I got the message. And I said, well, why don't you sit down and contemplate what's being shown to you? So he was quiet for a minute or two, and he says, I completely understand now. He said, this man, he speared me in a past life. He killed me by spearing me in the throat. And I died with such rage and such fear that it's energetically locked in to my throat center. And he says, but I've been shown all that came before, kind of all the karma that necessitated my dying this way. And I've seen everything that got resolved since. He said, I understand that this is just a moment that was very, very helpful. He said, but I have to go now and re-experience the death in love and in compassion. So I said, yeah, go ahead and do that. And so he did. He re-experienced his death. There wasn't the anger or the fear. And he, as soon as he was starting to come out, he said, it's resolved. I'm not going to have this again. And he's been in touch with me since. He's never had a recurrence of the laryngitis. Now I love that story because in a way it shows us that the Akashic Records is interactive. It's not fixed. So he had an experience where he died a certain way, but he's able to go into it and correct it in a way. Not to be too blasphemous, but sometimes I think like we get take one, take two. So like take one, Jesus on the cross. To hell with all of you. And no, Jesus, take two. Oh, forgive you for you know not what you do. Take, good. You didn't have to come back with sore wrists or something like that. I'm glad you're laughing, and I still have Catholic stuff for that. Now, I have a separate practice. Well, I really don't have much of a clinical practice anymore. I travel too much. I just have grandfathered in clients. But you see people that deal with suicidality, and there's people that have been chronically suicidal almost their whole life. Well, I keep my practices separate. So I have a third-party insurance-based practice, and then I see people in the woo-woo New Age stuff. But for my own liability, I keep them separate. But every now and then, nowadays with Google, people say, this client had seen me for years, said, what? You're at Edgar Cayce? You do past life regression? Why don't we do one with me? And so I said, okay, you have to cross over into my woo-woo world. You have to pay for it out of pocket just to keep it separate. And she had a chronic suicide pattern in this lifetime. And she saw 3 lifetimes. She saw a lifetime where she had been suicidal and taken her life. She saw a lifetime where she had been suicidal but didn't take her life. And the third one was no suicide. It was just very fruitful. And so this experience, I wouldn't say that it was the only factor, but it was very helpful for her to move on. She first started to see me because doctors had told her that she would never have a baby. And my first, having grown up with 5 doctors, I just told her, I just wanted to break that hypnosis. I just said, maybe yes, maybe no. Doctors don't know everything. And she said, really? And so it turned out that she had fibroids, and she found out, we talked about Edgar Cayce, she started doing castor oil packs, and now she has 2 kids. And so, nice story. But you know what the best indicator for longevity, the truest indicator for longevity at diagnosis of cancer? It's what the doctor tells the patient. When you come in all afraid, you're so focused, the doctor says, I think you have 6 months to live. You accept that suggestion, so be careful. That's just, doctors don't know. Growing up with doctors, they're forced to be more certain than they can actually be. So anyway, that's other uses of a suggestibility. So people contact you can find out about your life purpose, about why you've come into this life, what patterns you're working on from past lives, how it applies to this life. We're so much more than we think we are, meaning that a past life regression will both wake you up to tremendous potentialities that you have, but it will also show you stubborn patterns that you're still working through. Yes, and then when I went to Detroit, people started having different experiences. I used to say behind the door is a past life. They went into these healing color experiences. And now I've evolved to the suggestion, behind the door is just what you need at this time. Of course, you establish that with the client. If a client wants a past life memory, then you go ahead and promote that. But I think that this work is guide driven. And so I have, it's like when you go to doctors have specialties, and I think I have a specialty, and it's no longer just past life regression. So people come in, and I would say that more often I have, this is kind of like the menu of what people get. You can get a past life memory. Sometimes you get the pattern that you're wanting to deal with through multiple past lives. Sometimes you contact your guides, you go into these healing spaces. People oftentimes contact deceased loved ones, especially if it's been a recent passing. You have symbolic or dreamlike experiences that are very helpful. Now, the people get hung up on, is it real? And I tell people, is it helpful? Because what is reality anyway? Reality is consciousness-based. When you're having a dream, that's real. When you're here, this is real. So where you're at declares the reality. And so to me, it's like if it's a dream or whether it's a past life, did it have an emotional release? Has it gifted you something? Carl Jung used to do this work, and he called it creative imagination. He didn't want people getting caught up in whether it was real. Let's pretend it's all made up. It's just coming from your subconscious. And it is. It is all coming up from your subconscious. I believe that the psyche wants to heal itself. Just like if you cut your hand, your body has natural healing processes. It's the same thing. Your psyche naturally wants you, and if you open up to this, your dreams will give you healing ideas. This experience will do that too. Some people, this is not a specialty of mine, but Brian Weiss, for example, has taken people into future lives. I've had a couple of those. Probably the first one I had was, this person was in a deep trance and was whispering. And they said, the Marines are rebuilding the world. And I'm like, what? The Marines are rebuilding the world? And they're like, no. The Lemurians are rebuilding the world. So the Lemurians, not the Marines. So I'm glad I asked, or my book would have been totally wrong. So that was one future life thing. Maybe it's because they said Peter's hearing isn't good enough for this. And then sometimes you go into the in-between state, or you get direct answers to questions. Oh, we're at the end. That I'll go into more depth of what happens in the in-between life experience on Wednesday. So you saw me today for free. You can see me just free all week long. So I'm on sale. All right, we have a little bit of time for, that's kind of the ideas that I wanted to cover for today. Did I have? Yeah. Are there any questions?